Hi, it's Zeke with the Eastside Church of Christ in Baytown, Texas. I'm so glad you joined us today for another study of great chapters of the Bible. This time we're going to be in the Old Testament. We're going to be taking a look at Genesis chapter 39, in which I've titled Joseph, Dedicated Discipline. You'll find out why in just a moment. Joseph is a true hero in the Old Testament. And looking for heroes is kind of a precarious process. Usually in our day and time, we look for good characteristics in people, but all too often they are complicated by the flaws that are inherent in any person. We look to entertainers, athletes, politicians, celebrities, doctors, humanitarians, statesmen, whoever they may be. And we find all too often that in spite of whatever heroic qualities they may possess, sometimes they're just completely offset by the flaws and the shortcomings of character in that person. Even biblical heroes sometimes are fraught with flaws. I mean, after all, Abraham lied to save his own skin. Jacob schemed to enrich himself. Even Moses sometimes was frustrated and even argued with God. But Joseph shines like a beacon throughout his life's history. In Genesis chapter 39, Joseph had been sold to Ishmaelites, who then are later going to sell him to an Egyptian official. But by this time, Joseph had already showed himself in several ways. Now, earlier when you read Genesis chapter 37, where the story of Joseph begins, it goes all the way through Genesis 50. In fact, we could have chosen any one of those chapters, and it would have been a great chapter on the life of Joseph. But Genesis 39 to me just speaks of the truly heroic qualities we find in him. Joseph is the big underdog in the story, but he shines. His parents thought that he was odd. We read about a couple of dreams that he had in Genesis chapter 37. His brothers hated him because of their misconception of him. But God had plans for Joseph, and he implemented them through the difficulties that Joseph had to endure in his life. And 4 times in our chapter, Genesis 39, we find some variation that says God was with him. Yahweh was with Joseph. But that doesn't mean that, although it says God was with him, that it was easy for Joseph. I am struck by the discipline that Joseph learned early on, and that was a hallmark of his character throughout his whole life. Even as he experienced hardship, the conduct that he showed displayed that he was a young man who was willing to be molded for God's use. So let's get into this chapter, Genesis 39, where we'll read about Joseph's discipline of service. Read with me the first 6 verses. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. And Yahweh was with Joseph. So he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. Now his master saw that Yahweh was with him, and how Yahweh caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal servant, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he owned he put in his charge. And it came about that from the time he made him overseer in his house and over all that he owned, Yahweh blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus, Yahweh's blessing was upon all that he owned in the house and in the field. So he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge, and was with him there, and with him there he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. Now, Joseph understood his role of service to Potiphar. Of course, he was a slave. He was sold as a slave, and there were certain expectations that a slave would have. But service was nothing new to Joseph. In fact, he learned it as a much younger boy, although at this point he's not much more than maybe a teen himself. Go back with me. We mentioned Genesis 37 before. Let's go back there and look at a snapshot of an episode in Joseph's life before his brothers sold him into slavery. In Genesis chapter 37, it tells us in verse 12 that his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. Now they were living in Hebron at this time, and Hebron, or rather Shechem, was about 50 miles from Hebron. So they went quite a ways to find some good pasture for their flock. And it says in verse 13 that Israel, that's Jacob, said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send you to them." And he said to him, "I will go." Then he said to him, "Go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring back word to me." So he sent them from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. How long did it take Joseph to get to Shechem? Who knows? At the very least, a couple of good long walking days. Verse 15 says, "A man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. And the man asked him, 'What are you looking for?' And he said, 'I'm looking for my brothers. Please tell me where they are pasturing the flock.' And the man said, 'They've moved from here, for I heard them say, Let us go to Dothan.' So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan." Now I bring this snapshot, as I called it before, I bring it up just to give us a glimpse of the attitude of service that Joseph had. His father sent them 50 miles away to go look for his brothers. And notice his attitude. He says, "I will go." And not only that, but when he got there, he had to go about another 15 or so miles to Dothan to actually find them. And he did. He went. Even though he was sent to brothers who hated him, even though he was hugely inconvenienced by having to go further than he first thought, Joseph's attitude was one of service. And when we go back to chapter 39 of Genesis, we find that everything that Joseph did prospered. Look again at verse 3. His master saw that Yahweh was with him, and how Yahweh caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. Well, why did things prosper in Joseph's hand? Was it just because God magically made things happen for him? No. It's because Joseph worked at it. He understood, as we all should about service, that it's about recognizing responsibility. And Joseph seized on diligent service because that was his responsibility. He could have slouched enough just to get by, but he didn't. The implication is that he was diligent enough, hardworking enough to do a good job. Proverbs 21 verse 5 tells us that the plans of the diligent lead surely to advantage, but everyone who is hasty comes surely to poverty. I believe the advantage that Proverbs 21 verse 5 is talking about here is the success of the project. That when you give your all to it, you do it in such a way that's going to ensure that success. I remember years ago, my mother used to tell me, it still rings in my ears even to this day. She said, anything worth doing is worth doing right. And Joseph certainly had that idea. In Proverbs 12 and in verse 14, it tells us that a man will be satisfied with good by the fruit of his words, and the deeds of a man's hands will return to him. And of course, we see that with Joseph. Long before this proverb was ever written, Joseph understood that the job I do is somehow going to have consequences and repercussions to me. So I'm going to do the best that I can. And he certainly did that. But don't forget that the Lord was with Joseph because Joseph was with the Lord. Joseph understood, I think, underneath the surface of this text, Joseph understood that the most important service of all was to God. The Bible tells us that we ought to do the best that we can, knowing that what we do for men, we do for God. And Joseph understood that. Romans 12 verse 11 says this, not lagging behind in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. I believe that Joseph knew with all his heart that the service he offered to this pagan, foreign official came from a heart that wanted to do his best, because he knew that even this far away from his homeland, from his family, from all that he knew that was familiar, God was watching. Joseph understood that it's not always about the big things. It's about doing the little things well. And that's what Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 25. In the second half of that chapter, Jesus describes this judgment scene. There's a great separation. The sheep are on the right hand, the goats are on the left. And Jesus talks about how the sheep had done things that you and I would almost take for granted. They had brought him water. They visited him when he was in prison. They helped him when he was sick. And they said, "When did we do this for you? When did we bring you a cup of cold water? When did we ever help you when you were sick?" And Jesus said, of course, "Even as you did it to the least of these, my brethren, you did it for me." It's about the small things and doing the small things well that will help us do the big things when that time comes. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 39, and let's read about Joseph's discipline of self-control. As we continue in verse 7, the end of verse 6 tells us that Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. So we're told right off the bat that Joseph is a good-looking guy. Do you think he used that, though, to his advantage? Do you think that he used his looks to somehow gain the upper hand? Let's read about it. In verse 7 it says, "It came after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph, and she said, 'Lie with me.' But he refused, and said to his master's wife, 'Behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge, and there is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?' As she spoke to Joseph day after day, he did not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household was there inside. She caught him by the garment, saying, 'Lie with me.' And he left his garment in her hand, and he fled and went outside. And when she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, she called to the men of the household and said to them, 'See, he has brought in a Hebrew to us to make sport of us. He came in here to lie with me, and I screamed. And when he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled and went outside. So he left his garment beside her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with these words, 'The Hebrew slave whom you brought to us came into me to make sport of me. And as I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled outside.'" Well, we'll stop there for now. We're told at the end of verse 6 that Joseph was good looking, handsome, it says, in form and appearance. But he didn't exploit it. Consider what's going on. Joseph's boss's wife is putting the moves on him. She's making advances towards him. Joseph is a young man. And as any young man, especially one that's handsome enough to have been made advances upon by his boss's wife, he might have been thinking certain things, maybe rationalizations that people even put to themselves today. He might have been thinking, well, no one will never know. Besides, everybody's doing it, and maybe it'll help me advance. I wonder if those thoughts ever crossed Joseph's mind. Actually, I doubt it, because he had a choice, and he knew that if he exercised his will, his choice, no one else could do it for him. Aristotle said this. Aristotle said, "What it lies in our power to do, it lies in our power not to do." Choices, and very often their consequences, lie entirely with us. And Joseph understood this. She began to tell him in verse 7, "Lie with me." But verse 8 just simply says, he refused. And the implication to us is that there was no equivocating on Joseph's part. He didn't think, oh, should I do this? No one will ever know me. Everybody else is doing it. Maybe it will help me get along in this household even more than I have already. He refused. His answer was quick and it was certain. These are excuses that far too often people today use. But far before Proverbs 6 was written, Joseph understood the danger of giving himself in to an adulteress. Go with me to Proverbs chapter 6 for a moment. Proverbs chapter 6. Read with me beginning in verse 23. It says, the commandment is a lamp and the teaching is light. And it's talking about the godly advice that a father gives to his son. And reproofs for discipline are the way of life. Why? To keep you from the evil woman, from the smooth tongue of the adulteress. Do not desire her beauty in your heart. Do not let her capture you with her eyelids. For on account of a harlot, one is reduced to a loaf of bread, and an adulteress hunts for the precious life. Can a man take fire in his bosom and his clothes not be burned? Or can a man walk on hot coals and his feet not be scorched? So is the one who goes in to his neighbor's wife. Whoever touches her will not go unpunished. Men do not despise a thief if he steals, to satisfy himself when he's hungry. But when he's found, he must repay sevenfold. He must give all the substance of his house. The one who commits adultery with a woman is lacking sense. He would destroy himself who does it. Wounds and disgrace he will find, and his reproach will not be blotted out, for jealousy enrages a man, and he will not spare in the day of vengeance. He will not accept any ransom, nor will he be satisfied, though you give many gifts. I apologize, first of all, for the misprint on this slide. That should say Proverbs 6:23 through 35, which we just read. But you got the gist of that whole thing, right? There are certain sanctions against adultery that the proverb writer spells out for us. One of which is self-destruction in verse 32. The one who would destroy himself does it. The wounds, the loss of respect, the public disgrace that he speaks of in verse 33. A husband that is bent on revenge in verse 34. And no way to buy oneself out of trouble in verse 35. Proverbs 7 in verse 23 says, he does not know that it will cost him his life. I think Joseph thought about all this stuff. And it went through his mind so quickly that he knew the only answer was no. Go back to Genesis chapter 39 with me, and you see that instead of thinking himself and his own desires, he thought about God. Look with me, if you will, in verse 9. He thought about his master and the responsibility that his master has put on him. But at the end of that verse, he says, how then could I do this great evil and sin against Potiphar? No, that's not what he said. He said, how could I do this and sin against God? See, Joseph considered not only the consideration of what would displease God, but also what would please him. Thinking of God first helped him see the severity of the sin, and it helped him summon the strength to refuse. And he told her exactly why he was doing it. Now, to her, it probably didn't mean anything. She was not a God worshiper, and this God of Joseph meant absolutely nothing to her, so she cared not about the morals that God wanted to induce in his people. But to Joseph, it certainly meant something. Notice in verse 10 of Genesis 39, it says that she spoke to Joseph day after day. Think about the continual pressure that was put on Joseph. But it says he did not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. I think the implication is that the pressure was so great that Joseph did anything he could just to avoid her, not even to be around her. Of course, that would be difficult for a woman who's probably in the house all the time, and Potiphar, her husband, is gone doing whatever it was that Potiphar did as his position as the captain of Pharaoh's bodyguard. And he knew Joseph's best option was to simply avoid her altogether. You know, sometimes we see this kind of pressure, and other men have caved to that. One of the ones I'm thinking about is Samson. In Judges 14 and in Judges 16, it tells us of the pressure that certain women brought upon Samson and how he caved to that pressure. But not Joseph. He just wouldn't do it. Proverbs 5, verses 5 through 6 and verse 8 say this: "For the lips of an adulteress drip honey, and smoother than oil is her speech. But in the end she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death, her steps take hold of Sheol. She does not ponder the path of life. Her ways are unstable. She does not know it. Keep your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house." Well, of course, Joseph was already inside the house. That's what his work entailed. But he did his best to keep as far from her as he possibly could. But while spurning her was the right thing, it wasn't the easy thing. And we see that towards the end of the section that we had just read. She's so desperate to be with him that she grabs him by the garment in verse 12. And Joseph leaves it there in her hand. He kind of, I don't know, maybe shrugs out of the garment and runs off. He flees from her, literally. He didn't try to talk her out of it. He didn't try to make excuses. And he certainly didn't try to rationalize why he might have given in to himself or to her. He just ran away. He did what he knew he had to do, in spite of the fact that he probably knew that there were going to be some repercussions and the consequences would be difficult for him. So let's read about those consequences and the enduring discipline, this time of suffering, that Joseph endured. In verse 19, it tells us, "Now when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, 'This is what your slave did to me,' his anger burned. So Joseph's master took him, put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the jail. But Yahweh was with Joseph, and extended kindness to him, and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in the jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge, because Yahweh was with him, and whatever he did, Yahweh made to prosper." We'll stop there. Now, obviously, Potiphar's wife, we're not even given her name. She was a conniving, vengeful liar, but she was a powerful, conniving, vengeful liar. Notice that she presents this coat as evidence or proof that her false claim is true. Notice also that this is the second time that an article of Joseph's clothing was used to spread a lie about him. The first time was when his brothers sold him into slavery and they smeared Joseph's multicolored coat with blood, the one that his father Jacob had given to him, presented the bloody coat to his father as supposed evidence that Joseph had been killed by some wild animal. Now another garment that Joseph owned is being used against him to spread a horrific lie, one that's surely going to have terrible repercussions for him. And still, Joseph controlled, as we've seen before, not only his appetites. He didn't give in as a young man, and maybe any other young man might have. He controlled also his tongue and the natural inclination to defend himself, to maybe even call for revenge. He didn't do that. Proverbs 20 verse 22 says, "Do not say, I will repay evil. Wait for Yahweh, and He will save you." This is exactly what Joseph did. And long before Paul the Apostle wrote Romans 12, Joseph understood it. Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men, if possible. So far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." And so Joseph showed great strength, great maturity, great trust and faith in God by leaving it with Him. Consider that Joseph is a young man, probably not out of his teens yet. We read later on that when Joseph stood before Pharaoh, as Pharaoh promoted him, Joseph was 30 years of age. And we don't know how many years have gone by since up to that time. But probably by this time, Joseph is maybe barely out of his teens. We don't know how long he was in Potiphar's household, long enough to distinguish himself and set himself apart by his integrity from everyone else. But he's still a young man. And already in his young life, he's felt the sting of being looked at differently by his own parents, of being hated by his brothers, of being sold into slavery by those who should have loved him most, of being sold again to the house of Potiphar, and then being terribly abused by his boss's wife, and now finally thrown into prison. That's a lot for a young man, any young man, to go through. And yet, all this suffering is helping to make Joseph a man, and not just any man. He learned to be a man of God. He's learning some things through this suffering that maybe you and I need to learn through the suffering that you and I go through. One of the lessons that we can learn is the lesson of endurance. Go with me to the New Testament in James chapter 2. James chapter 2. In the New Testament book of James chapter 1, James 1, beginning in verse 2. James says, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." Now, of course, we realize that James isn't telling us that we ought to jump for joy when trouble comes upon us. But he says, recognize this, that getting through it, enduring it, and you know what endurance means. It means to be steadfast in your persistence in getting through it. He says, this endurance is going to have a positive effect on you, but you don't endure unless you go through it, do you? Well, Joseph was learning the positive lessons of endurance, part of which are deeper faith and trust in a God upon whom we can cast our anxiety. In Hebrews chapter 6, make a short left with me if you will, to Hebrews 6. Begin with me in verse 11, Hebrews 6 and in verse 11. The Hebrew writer says, "We desire that each one of you show the same diligence so as to realize the full assurance of hope until the end, so that you'll not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises." Now the Hebrew writer tells his audience, don't give up. Don't give up. Through faith, you can persist. Through faith, you can be steadfast. Through faith, you can endure. He tells us there in verse 12 that those who through faith and patient persistence inherit the promises. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it for one moment and say it's easy. You and I both know that it's not. But we can see by Joseph's example that it can certainly be done. And if this young man can do it, then I'm going to say that so can you and I. Because Joseph had the hope of better things. In the book of 2 Corinthians, Paul speaks of this. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, go there with me. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, read with me beginning in verse 16. 2 Corinthians 4, beginning in verse 16. Paul says, "We do not lose heart, but though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. For momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. While we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal." And while we're reading Paul's inspired words, it might help us to remember that Paul was another one of those, like Joseph, who suffered terrible things because of his utter faith and trust in God. In fact, if you'll back up a little bit in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, he talks about, in verse 8, being afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not despairing, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. Why? Because of the hope that he speaks about. In verses 16 through 18, the same hope that he tells us can be instilled in us. He calls the suffering that we go through in this life, and maybe even the horrific treatment that he himself was subject to, light, momentary affliction. And he says it is that when you compare it with the great weight of blessing that God intends to bestow on us. We've seen a pattern in Joseph. Let me go back there to Genesis chapter 39. Joseph entered Potiphar's house a slave, and he ended up the manager. In the last section that we just read, where Joseph was thrown into prison, where the king's prisoners were kept, verse 20 tells us, it tells us that again God was with him, and Joseph distinguished himself to his captors. He entered this prison, an alleged rapist, and ended up being the chief trustee. Verse 23 says that the chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge because Yahweh was with him. And that's the key to this whole thing. Yahweh was with him and gave him success. He made everything in his hand to prosper. Maybe the biggest success that Joseph had was his unswerving loyalty to God. God was with Joseph because Joseph was with God. And there are some applications for you and me. I don't want us to miss these things because they're so glaring in Joseph's life story, especially this chapter, this great chapter that we read today. We need to recognize that you and I should be dedicated to discipline, just as Joseph was. We need to be disciplined enough to serve. We looked at James 1, verses 2 and 4 before, that reminded us of how we need to recognize the positive implications of difficulty in our lives, and how sometimes just keeping our head down and doing the hard work of serving will help us to get through it. Ecclesiastes 9 verse 10 says this: "Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might." Colossians 3 verse 23 says to do your work heartily, not as to men, but as to the Lord, because He's watching. And we need to realize that this service should go on all the time. We shouldn't be content to rest on our past service, but be constantly busy. We should be, as Joseph was, disciplined enough for self-control. We saw where in Hebrews chapter 6, the Hebrew writer calls us to be diligent and persevere faithfully through what it is that we need to continue doing in order to obtain the promises. But we need to discipline ourselves in order to do that. No one can do it for us. Self-control is just that. It is control of self, and no one else can do that for you. And finally, we need to be disciplined enough for suffering, recognizing the promises that are there just as sure as the suffering is. Someone asked C.S. Lewis the question, why do the righteous suffer? And Mr. Lewis said, why not? They're the only ones who can take it. Why? Because we have this unwavering hope that Paul described to us in 2 Corinthians 4, verses 16 through 18. And it's this hope that's going to take us to our full potential. I want us to read together one final passage. This is in Romans chapter 5. Go there with me, please. Romans chapter 5. In Romans 5, begin with me in verse 3. Romans 5 and verse 3. Paul, the inspired writer, says, not only this, but we also exult in our tribulations, knowing that tribulation brings about perseverance, and perseverance, proven character, and proven character, hope. And hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out within our hearts through the Holy Spirit who was given to us. Well, I hope that you can see that Joseph's dedicated discipline enabled him to endure through all the difficulties that he went through. And of course, there are many more episodes of great faith in God that are displayed in Joseph's life all the way through the rest of the book of Genesis. I told you before that his story is told to us from Genesis chapter 37 all the way through Genesis 50. Find another one of those chapters and look at how underlying all of Joseph's story is his character of dedicated discipline and service to God. The Lord was with Joseph because Joseph was with the Lord. And the Lord will be with you through your difficulties if you'll be with him. We see that Joseph was pliable, willing to be used for purposes that he couldn't imagine, thus not only saving himself but an entire nation. And who knows the profound effect you can have on somebody else simply by your dedicated discipline. Well, thanks again for joining us today, and I hope we'll see you again in another great chapter of the Bible. Thanks, and God bless.